The new Miss Nevada is a transgendered man, and Mattel is producing a non-binary Barbie doll. We need to talk. A transgender doll. The sexual revolution continues to accelerate, taking with it everything in its wake. Given the disdain of modern culture for biology, science, and even decency, there is an intention to destroy everything related to masculinity and femininity, and it is done at our children's earliest stages of development. Mattel, the maker of Barbie dolls, has now created a non-binary doll. That means no obvious gender markings. Carefully manicured features betray no obvious gender. The lips are not too full, the eyelashes are not too long and fluttery, the jaw is not too wide, there's no Barbie-like breasts or Ken-like shoulders. They say that it's because the population of young people today identifying as non-binary is growing. One survey puts that at 27% of teenagers in the state of California are gender non-conforming. I wonder how many teenagers are actually playing with Barbie dolls. Those dolls are aimed at our youngest children. One mother, in a recent article that I read, said that this is all a fad, the transgender movement. It appeals to a young person's desire to rebel. In fact, she went on to say, "My daughter tells me if you're not trans, you're weird." Well, the Supreme Court has refused to take a stand once again. In 2021, there was a court case coming out of Dallas High School in Dallas, Oregon, where a young woman decided to identify as a boy. The school, the principal, allowed her to use the boys' restroom and to be called by a masculine name as she was at school. As other students and eventually parents began to complain, the case became a lawsuit, with the school arguing that they had to separate her and give her her own bathroom. They made that accommodation, but she wouldn't accept it. The court decided not to accept the case when it got all the way to the Supreme Court, which allowed that ruling of the lower court that the school must allow this young girl to go into the boys' restroom. They allowed that decision to stand. Not only is it that they want to allow people who identify as their non-biological gender to go into places that are typically reserved for the other gender. Now we have what's called gender fluid, which means that a gender identity can fluctuate between male and female identities on a daily basis. So cabins, locker rooms, bathrooms, athletic competitions, even the military will eventually be held captive to the daily choices of whatever individuals decide to identify as. School employees, for example, will have to be subject to the whims, the mercy of whatever a student chooses to self-certify or identify on any given day. Well, the Supreme Court has followed up that 2020 decision with another punt. They refused this week to accept another case, this one from Virginia. A Virginia school board lost its fight to keep single-sex restrooms and locker rooms divided between biological boys and girls. A young woman, born female, who goes by the name Gavin Grimm, began identifying as a male while attending high school in Gloucester County, Virginia. The principal initially allowed Grimm to use the boys' restroom, but school policy required students to use the facilities according to their biological sex. So the school gave, again, the option for a single-stall restroom just for this one student. Instead, She sued for sex discrimination in 2015. Lower courts ruled in her favor in 2019 and 2020. And Monday of this week, the Supreme Court declined to hear the school board's appeal. Justices Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas said that they would have been happy to hear the case. And eventually, the Supreme Court is going to have to do something here. Why did they let the decision stand? Well, they typically hid behind the idea that they didn't have a disagreement between two lower courts, and the Supreme Court tries to reserve its rulings for those places where the law is so unclear as to be disagreed with at the lower courts. It's interesting that the court case, the Supreme Court case that is used to justify these decisions is a court case from 2020 called Bostock versus Clayton. In that case, the Supreme Court, speaking specifically about the workplace, ruled that that people have to be allowed to function according to the gender choice that they make. But Justice Gorsuch, in that case, specifically argued that this was about workplace parity, but it was not about locker rooms or bathrooms. And yet, despite that explicit prohibition, the Bostock case has been used already and will continue to be used by the transgender agenda to try and make the case that there are no limitations on what that means. Back in 1958, Justice Earl Warren of the Supreme Court argued that there was what he called evolving standards of decency. In other words, he implied that as morality changes, that's progress. The problem is, in 1958, who would have ever thought that to be truly woke in this generation, you would have to believe that men give birth to babies or have periods, and that it's fair for women to be required to compete in sports with biological males who identify as females. Today, to be a radical secularist is to accept chaos, immorality, and absolute absurdity. The great enemy of the radical transgender movement is science. Biological realities can be stubborn, and the fact of the matter is, you can tamper with them all you want to, but their agenda is irrational and won't ultimately solve the problems that they think that they're solving. When it comes to the transgender movement, also parental rights are being rejected. Parents are despairing as they find out in their public school systems that their children can be diagnosed with one or more gender dysphoria disorders and then treated with no information given to the parents. In fact, parents who object are often criticized as not being affirming or too rigid in traditional terms. Now think about that. In the psychological definitions right now in this country, gender dysphoria is labeled as a mental disorder, and yet it's the only mental disorder on the books that we routinely not only treat in minors without parental consent, it's also the only mental disorder that we expect everybody else in the country to adjust to. If somebody says, I'm schizophrenic, I can feel compassion for that person, I can want to minister to that person, but I don't have to believe the voices that are in their heads. The same with transgender dysphoria. I can minister, I want to help those who are hurting and in pain because of their disconnect with who they are. But we're being asked to play the game and believe the fantasy. And that is wrong. Parents are told that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones may be the only way to prevent their children from committing suicide. And yet what the statistics actually show us is that those who have life-altering, body-changing surgery often come back to a real regret because they discover that changing their external body doesn't solve the internal divisions in their mind. That's why the suicide rate of those who have transgender surgeries is now over 40%. What do we do about this? How do we think biblically? Well, as for those children who think they are transgender, we must listen to what they say. We must hear their concerns and provide a safe place where they can feel free to express their feelings. We have to warn against body-altering surgery that is done in the name of being somehow more authentic. There's a growing number of stories of those who have gone through these kinds of surgeries who discovered that they didn't solve their psychological stresses. As I've said, the suicide rate is about 41%. It's dangerous to place our children in public schools where they are being indoctrinated into pagan sexuality, the normalcy of deviant behavior, and the mockery of God's intention for men and women. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God." That's Matthew 19:14. And then we read that He took them in His arms and He blessed them. I don't think Jesus would take children into His arms and then pass them off to pagans who tell them that they need two mothers or two fathers, or that they are not special and valuable as God made them and intended them to be. We must return to the creation account to remind ourselves and our children that God created two genders, male and female. Without a belief in God as creator, there's little hope of making sense of our lives and the roles that we're intended to have in marriage, the family, and of course, sexuality. We want to see people freed from their internal pain. We want to see them find resolution from the emotional torment that they're experiencing. But no amount of compassion can change biological and chromosomal realities. That's why the transgender movement is starting to hit the wall, because science is against it. In Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul said this, "For though they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. Therefore God delivered them over in the desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, so that their bodies were degraded among them." Here's the bottom line. As Christians, do we have the courage to protect our children, to stand against the bullies who are trying to force this agenda on us? We must be prepared for the radicals who will call us hateful names, all the while claiming that they have the moral high ground. To love transgenders, we must work through the complicated layers of sin and pain that they experience, a process that requires the relational context that churches can provide. It's the death knell for us to condemn something but then say we can't help. We must help, but we need to help people lean into their pain and not seek a deceptive antidote for their internal suffering with permanent external irreversible changes. What do we say to somebody who says, "Well, I'm a gay Christian," or "I'm a trans Christian"? Well, I love this quote from Ann Paulk. She gave a wise answer. She said, "Satan calls you by your sinful name. God calls you a Christian who struggles with identity issues. Gender identity, the gender that you were born with, is fundamental to self-knowledge. You are not a gay Christian. You are not a transgendered Christian. If you're truly a Christian, let us in the church struggle with you, but don't accept the lies that come to you from this culture and provide a seemingly easy way out of your distress." Remember, those who walk in darkness do not see things as they are. Rather, they see things the way they want them to be. Proverbs 4:19 says, "The way of the wicked is like darkness. They do not know over what they stumble." To avoid a world blinded by pain and searching to soothe the emptiness, Jesus makes this promise. In Matthew chapter 11, He says this, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take up my yoke and learn from me, because I am lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." The church must be the church. We can't hide from the transgender movement. We need to race forward and compete, contend for the souls of those being destroyed by a culture that has lost their ever-loving mind. But as we do this, knowing the opposition will come, we need to remember Jesus is in the trenches with us in the business of saving souls. This is Truth Currents.